All right, thank you all for joining us for the How to Give Constructive Feedback on Colleagues and Mentees Writing Projects workshop. Joining us today is Dr. Rebecca Rice, Professor in Communication Studies. They are going to discuss how to form and deliver constructive feedback and productive feedback, or deliver constructive and productive feedback. So with further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Rice.
Okay, hi everyone. So glad you could be here this morning. So today we're going to talk about giving feedback in graduate school. In the fall, I did a workshop where we focused more on receiving feedback.
Hey, Dr. Rice, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Or
how's it
just
going?
yeah, you cut out for a moment right whenever you were introduced, and I apologize.
Okay, I'm back. Anyway, so the good news is as a grad student, on one hand, you're already an expert at feedback in some areas. You have been probably a student for a while, so you're already a pro at receiving writing feedback. You're learning to be a pro at designing your own projects and papers, and you already know what it feels like to be a student. And all of those things can be powerful and useful when designing feedback for other people. Especially when it comes to writing feedback, you've probably received a lot of it, which means that you've seen feedback that really helped you and maybe even totally changed your writing style or how you form ideas. And unfortunately, you might have received some feedback that you thought was either not useful or was even destructive. So I always say we should be the change we wish to see in the feedback world, especially in the peer review process. And that's something that I hope you can carry forward is what feedback helped me, what spirit of criticism helped me to grow as a person, and what maybe didn't help me as much. But you're also new at perhaps teaching, if anyone's teaching right now, and giving feedback in that area, mentoring, whether that's through mentoring programs or through being part of a research team where you might supervise other students, and helping others design projects, which is a little different than designing projects yourself. So how do you help students to understand what it means to write a good paper or to design a good research question? So this can all be new territory. So we're going to take what you have, which is already an expertise in being there yourself, and then we're just going to talk through some tips today that can help you give feedback to the different audiences you might be talking to. So one thing that matters, obviously, is that you are in a bunch of different professional relationships right now, and how you give feedback to these different groups can be different depending on the context. So I'm a communication studies professor, and one thing we talk about is there is no silver bullet on message design, right? There's no one way to say something to someone that's the best way, because you also have to consider your relationship, the context, previous interactions you've had. What are you talking about in this current situation right now? So for students, for example, one thing you'll want to think about if you're giving them feedback is what is the goal of the class? You know, what kind of feedback am I supposed to be giving them? What are my learning outcomes that I'm looking for? And then you can also consider what are they like as an individual as you build your relationship with students. Um, I find that sometimes, students do have a lot of their identity wrapped up in school. So if you give them feedback that feels like you are kind of not acknowledging their identity as a good student, that can be quite hurtful to them. So how can you give feedback that kind of preserves the ego and invites them to grow while feeling safe about the feedback you give them? With colleagues, right, with fellow grad students, there are also all kind of dynamics at play. It's great to swap papers with people in grad school, but you also might be friends. You might not quite be friends. You might not know a lot about each other. So you could consider the levels of the relationship that you're in with that person. Also, the context. What is your grad program like? What kind of feedback do you tend to give each other? And then stress is a big part of grad school, right? So how much feedback can this person hear right now? How much do they want constructive feedback? How much do they want support and affirmation, which are really important as we support each other as cohorts? And then with mentees, so if you're in a research lab setting or if you're doing any sort of peer mentoring or mentoring of undergraduate students, you might have to consider things like if they've ever done research before or not. There might be things you need to say to folks that they don't know because they've never been part of a research team before. And you can also consider things like what are the goals of this mentoring project along the way? So context matters a lot when you're giving feedback, and it's always good to take a step back and think, what is my relationship to this person? Because every message that we send each other has both a content level and a relationship level built into it. So every time you talk to someone, you're deciding how to build that relationship and not just what you're saying to them on the surface. Another thing, and this kind of goes to being the change we wish to see in the world, is that it really hurts sometimes when we get feedback on writing projects that feels like it cuts deep, right? So one thing I like to ask myself is, am I giving this person honest feedback, or am I kind of leaning toward being cruelly honest because of the ways I've been hurt by research feedback in the past? So I read once a really nice text post online about how honest feedback that is helpful but might be difficult for the person to hear should feel hard to give as the giver of the feedback, versus if you're kind of giving feedback in that feeling of like, ooh, I kind of want to rip into this project or tear it down, that can come with a feeling of excitement, right? Like, oh, I'm going to really get this person in this feedback. So I always just stop and ask myself, like, how am I feeling about giving this feedback? And if I'm feeling too like, oh, I'm going to tell them what's wrong with this, that's usually a good time to step back and say, how can I realign my goals so that I'm not tearing the other person down as I give them feedback? So we're going to go through the levels. Starting with giving feedback to students, this most likely comes in the form of grading, right? So 3 things that I think about when I'm giving feedback to students. First of all, consider the goal of the class and the project, and state both of those things to students often so that they understand why they're doing the assignment they're doing and what the purpose of the class is. If I do that, it's much easier for me to focus my feedback, because if I'm in a research and writing class, I'm going to give more feedback about writing style or designing arguments. If I'm in like my 300 level class on organizational communication, I'm looking more for understanding of theory and applying that theory. And I'm not going to spend as much time giving them advice about how to use APA format better, right? So I tell students that. I say the purpose of this assignment is to demonstrate that you understand and can apply this theory to your life. That is what I'm looking at, and that's what I'm going to give you feedback on. And I find that that really helps to avoid surprises, but also that students are often a little nervous about like the amount of pickiness you might apply to their writing. So if there's something that you're going to look at, like APA, I always tell them if I'm going to do that, and I explain to them why I want them to learn that. And I give them a lot of resources along the way. So I never want feedback to feel like a gotcha moment where it's like, I just looked for anything you did wrong to put a red mark on. And instead, I always want to align it with the learning objectives of the class. And that, I think, helps my students at least to relax a little more into doing the assignment for its intended purpose. Second, I think it's very helpful to be concrete. Along with this, I try not to use you so much in feedback, so I won't be like, you didn't do this. So I'll say the paper instead of you, because it feels a little less stressful. And instead of just saying like, you didn't do this thing, I'll say the paper lacks concrete examples. For example, in the second paragraph, it would be helpful to see an example of this concept. So I think giving examples helps students to understand what exactly is missing from a paper instead of just pointing out kind of a blanket statement. And that's not to say that you need to point out every time something concrete is or isn't happening, but 1 or 2 examples can really help kind of so that students can process the feedback more fully. And then I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but I have found that less is more in giving feedback to students. And there is some pedagogy research that backs this up, that says that if you pick like 3 to 5 priorities in papers and you say, these are the 3 to 5 things I would recommend you do to up your game in the next paper, that is much easier for students to implement than giving them the huge Canvas comment, right? The huge block of text. So that actually really helps me to focus on giving quality feedback and not just giving as much feedback as I can. And there might be smaller things that the student could work on, but if there are, I usually put at the end of my little 3 to 5 sentence feedback paragraph, if you would like to discuss ways to improve, grammar or sentence fluency or topic sentences, I'm available and would love to chat with you about this during these office hours. So inviting students, because I think we've all seen in teaching, you know, you have some students who are going to get the feedback, they're going to say, cool, and they're going to recycle the paper politely. And then you have some students who are always looking for something to do, right? They're like, oh, they're really looking for that next level in their developing of their writing. So I try to invite those conversations if students would like to have them. But if they don't, you're also a graduate student, right? You're busy. So if you're teaching, I think it's useful to focus on the top 3 to 5 things that students could do instead of spending 30 to 45 minutes or more on a single student paper. So those are some of the pieces of advice I would give about giving feedback to students. I can't see the chat box, but if we have any questions, I would be happy to take some if our lovely host can read them. Are we good?
Yeah, we don't have any chats right now, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to go ahead and start submitting.
Yeah, so next we'll move on to peer review and giving feedback to colleagues. But feel free to ask questions about any of this, and also feel free to just interrupt if you want to unmute. So peer review, if anyone has submitted to a journal before or submitted to a conference before, for the record, I did not do any of that in my master's, and I started halfway through my PhD. So you are not behind if you don't even know how this process works. But if you are asked to do peer review, sometimes, you know, student conferences, people give feedback, things like that. I have found through many peer review processes at this point that some things people do during peer review are incredibly helpful, but also a lot of people need to go to therapy instead of taking things out on the peer review process. And we are not going to be those people. We are going to be great peer reviewers. So here's what I have found from receiving feedback that helps me the most. The first thing is sometimes peer reviewers will read a paper and then they'll give me a 2 to 3 sentence summary of what my paper is doing. And that is so helpful because what I think my paper is doing and what readers think my paper is doing often are not the same the first time that someone reads the paper. So if you can give someone a summary after you read the paper of your paper appears to be about this, this is the argument that was made, this is the main contribution, that can really help people to see where as writers, we often expect our readers to mind read and they can't. And so all peer review feedback to me is valuable because it's a reader and it's someone who is not in my head. And no matter what they decided to write on the page, whatever they said, I tend to take as more important than my opinion of my own paper because they have a unique understanding of the paper that I don't because they're not in my brain. So starting with a summary is great. I also think it's great if you're reading fellow graduate students' work to come back and say, here's what I think your paper was doing. I think that's really helpful. Second, I just recommend an attitude of rooting for the paper. The best peer reviewers I've ever had have come right out and said, you know, this is what I think is really interesting here, and here's what would help to make the paper even stronger. So instead of some peer reviewers, I think, have a feeling of like, I'm going to reject this. I'm going to reject it. I hate it. And on the other hand, people who come in and say, here's what I would really love for this paper to do, even if they end up rejecting the paper, they tend to be so helpful for coming in with that attitude and saying, here's how I would strengthen what is already there that I think is interesting. And then back to the mind reading point, it's always gold to me when peer reviewers point out areas where they're confused, because wherever they're confused is usually a spot where I just haven't explained myself well enough. And that's something that you as a graduate student have the power to do right now in any peer review process, whether that is with your peers in your grad cohort, or whether that's for something like a conference review process, or my first day of my PhD, my advisor gave me a book chapter he was writing and said, what do you think of this? And I was terrified, right? I was like, I can't give this person feedback. But I just went through and pointed out areas where I didn't quite understand what was happening. And he ended up saying that was really helpful because he wanted to design a chapter that a graduate student could read and understand. So you have value in that you are a reader. And if you just come at any project with, I want this to be the best it can be and I'm going to root for it, that's a really helpful attitude that I think comes through in any comments you write. Oh, I don't know. I went backwards. Okay. So if you're doing peer review, whether it's formal or if you're paper swapping with other grad students, these are kind of the levels that I read the paper at. I usually read every paper twice. The first time I just read it And then I write down any impressions I have or things that confused me or just first thoughts about what's happening. And then I go back through and I kind of look to break it apart a little bit to make it stronger. So the main overview that I recommend you focus most of your energy on is the argument. So you have read peer-reviewed academic papers by this point. So you have read papers that confused you and papers that were really strong and really kind of strung together nicely. So the first questions I try to ask and help people develop are the claims of the paper interesting? Just on a basic level, is the paper trying to teach me something new that I think is worth reading? And if it doesn't feel like it's getting to the point of innovation yet, I try to explain that kindly to the writer, right? Like, I feel maybe I've heard some part of this argument in XYZ paper. I'm wondering about whatever was interesting in the paper that they maybe didn't know to let shine. Consider if you buy the claims of the paper, right? Is there good support in the literature review that shows what kind of they're promising are the trends in the field? Are the results or findings or the data interesting? And does the data line up with what they say it's doing, or do they need to include some other evidence? The number one thing that I have been told, and I now know is true, gets papers rejected from journals is that they can't explain why do this study and why do it right now. So those are two questions I always try to make sure get answered in any paper's intro. This could vary by field, right? But often I was told in graduate school, and I found it to be true, that just because you think something is interesting doesn't mean it needs to be studied right now, right? There are a lot of problems in the world that we could be researching. So explaining to people who maybe aren't quite in your sub area why that thing matters and why we need to do the study at this very moment is an important statement that you can help each other develop as you give feedback. Structurally, every single time I write a paper, I say one thing in the intro and I say a completely different thing in the conclusion. It's a normal thing that we write ourselves into arguments along the way. So you as a reader can ask, does the paper do what it promised in the intro? And if not, where does it actually end up? Usually wherever it ended up is far more interesting, and you just need to fix the intro so that it lines up with where the person actually ended up. Similarly, do all the sections make sense of the paper? Do they go from one to the other in a way that feels inevitable, is a question I often ask. Or does it feel like I don't know why this is here? And then the details, grammar, citation style, etc. I've had some peer reviewers help me with that before, and I appreciate. Sometimes there's just a typo. Like, I wrote a paper once about lightning strikes during a football game that caused a crowd safety issue. I said lighting strikes 8 to 10 times in this paper, and a peer reviewer caught it because Microsoft Word is going to think that's grammatically correct, right? They're not going to catch it. So sometimes you can help. I think it's worth asking people, especially if you're swapping papers with other grad students, would you like me to do things about grammar, sentence fluency, etc.? Because some people, that's exactly what they mean when they say, can you edit my paper? Other people want your general impression. So getting a sense of what feedback style people like is a really helpful thing to do before you go all in and put all the track changes in, because that also takes a lot of energy on your part. And some people are going to run it through Grammarly anyway, so they don't really need that from you. So one thing we talked about in the workshop in the fall that people seemed interested in is how to give difficult feedback or have difficult conversations. So I wanted to do a little section on that, and then I wanted to give us some time to maybe practice in the chat, not like public speaking assignments. But giving difficult feedback is one of those things that it feels like there's no map for in graduate school, right? So if you have a student who you're having like behavioral issues with, we know we're all worried about ChatGPT right now, if you have plagiarism going on, that is suddenly the moment where it's like, I don't know what to do. Or maybe you're supervising a student in a research lab and they're not showing up or they're not answering emails. So those can be really difficult situations as a graduate student because you're not fully like a professor yet, right? So it's hard to know how much feedback to give versus how much to protect your time and the fact that you are here to be a student first. So these are the 3 things that I still do that I would recommend you do regardless of what's happening. The first one is consult a mentor. So if you're teaching, if you have a course supervisor, they should be looped in on any sort of feedback that might be upsetting to a student, or any situation where you're not sure if you should engage with a student about an issue or not. If you don't have a course supervisor, if you have a basic course director in your department, or the chair of the undergraduate studies, so whatever professor is filling that role, that person should be looped in. And I recommend just asking them to set up a quick meeting about it, so that you can get some advice about what to do with the situation. I do recommend practicing. If you're going to have to give difficult feedback, it is hard to do. It's normal to be nervous about the conversation, and having some sort of practice conversation with one of those mentors or with a peer can be really helpful. I have never gone into a plagiarism meeting without calling my aunt on the phone because she's a professor, and I'm just being like, here's what I'm planning to say. What do you think about that? So I know that that's like a random tidbit about me and a privilege to have a professor that I can call, but don't underestimate how difficult the conversation can feel, even if it goes well, just because it can be emotionally fraught. The other thing is, if you have to give difficult feedback, it's really helpful if you can get it in writing in some way. So sending a follow-up email after the meeting where you say, hey, I just want to go over, this is what we discussed. This is the plan for what you're going to do to, fix this paper or whatever, and get as much of it spelled out in writing as you can. I've definitely been burned before by being like, oh, I know you didn't turn this paper in. You can turn it in by the weekend. And then the student turns it in at like 9 a.m. Monday morning. And they were like, well, it's the start of the workday Monday, so it doesn't count, right? So like now I never mess with that. I'm like, I need this paper by Friday at 11:59 p.m. in my inbox, or it will be a zero. So spelling out the deadline, the consequences, the exact time, just to make sure that you have your bases covered in case someone interprets a conversation differently than you. Similarly, if you feel like that's too formal, I just have a notepad next to my desk where whatever meeting I'm in with anyone in my office, I just jot down what's happening and I just take notes on what we're saying to each other. I do it all the time, so I don't think anyone thinks it's weird because it just looks like how I process and ensure that I understand like what my job is going to be at the end of the meeting. So having that is really nice because then you have a dated entry that says, hey, this is what we said to each other in this meeting. Also, I definitely recommend for difficult conversations, if they're with a student, definitely have them in some sort of department sanctioned space, whether you have an office or there's like a shared meeting room you can use. It can be useful to have someone else there or at least nearby. So I never take those meetings with the door closed also. Just keep the door open a little bit. I have, friends in my department who, if someone has to have a difficult conversation, that person is just going to be across the hall, just in case anyone needs to chat about anything, or not to scare you too much, but in case you need like a witness to kind of what happened in the conversation. So I know that those are all dark thoughts, but it is important to kind of protect yourself because feedback can feel fraught to the person you're giving it to. So it's just better to be over prepared than under prepared. I, again, still can't see the chat. So if anyone has questions, shout them out. Oh, okay. So we're going to practice. Let's start with what would we do to give feedback in this situation? So you're teaching a class, whether or not you're teaching a class right now, you can play along. And a student in your class spent the whole kind of workshop time in class goofing around, distracting students near them, showing people funny TikToks. What would be your plan to give feedback here?
Is it okay to take a shot?
Yeah, do it.
Awesome. Uh, if it were in my class, I would likely ask that person if we could chat for a few moments toward the end of class, especially once other students are leaving, to give privacy to the situation and just say, hey, I felt like I noticed that you were having trouble focusing. And I also felt like I noticed other students felt distracted from how you were in class today. Is there anything going on that we could talk about regarding why you were this way in class today? That way I was focusing on like my interpretation of the situation rather than accusing the student, because truthfully I probably wouldn't have any idea what was going on in that student's life before they came.
Yeah, I think that's a good plan. Thank you, Dustin. Yeah, so I will say sometimes students who are goofing off also are the fastest to book it out of the classroom. So it's good to just be aware that you might not catch them because they know sometimes that they're not really interested in having rapport with you. But I think pulling someone over at the end of class can be helpful. Sometimes I will just also say I don't notice behavior issues until other students point them out to me. So this did happen in my class, and I didn't really process, right, that the student was doing that until someone was like, that was kind of annoying. So in that case, I sent just an email after class where I said, hey, I noticed that similar to what was just said, perhaps we're having trouble focusing on during the workshop time in class today. And then I tried to assume positive intent, right? So I said something like, are there things I can do to help you get back on track with the project so you can use the workshop time productively next time? So that worked out. That person kind of right away was like, I'm very sorry. Just, not maybe thinking about the standards for workshop time in class. So I think either is a great plan. Does anyone else have other ideas or questions? Okay, do we want to do plagiarism or do we want to skip straight to peer drama?
I think plagiarism would be helpful.
Yeah, we've all been there, right? It's simple. You get that Turnitin score and it's hot. It's 95%. What is your plan to deal with this?
I will chime in if no one else wants to. I was kind of waiting to see if anybody wanted to go first.
Yeah.
When I was teaching in my master's program as a graduate assistant, a student turned in a paper that had a high percentage of plagiarized material. And so I sought advice from my primary mentor, who was actually the chair of my master's thesis, and just kind of got feedback. And I was guided toward giving that student like the opportunity to come to my office with an open door so it didn't feel threatening, and discuss kind of the gravity of the situation and how negatively that could affect their future if they decide to stay in academia, or in terms of just finishing their degree because of the potential for separation from the program or university. And then give that student the opportunity to take a zero, but then work to avoid that situation in the future. That way it was a learning opportunity and not kind of punitive strictly where that's it for the student and they don't have the choice or the option to kind of improve. That was my experience, and it did work with that student, but I can't say that it would work for every student.
Okay, yeah. So Elizabeth says working with the student to help identify where the problems were with the Turnitin score and working towards some points. Yeah, I think that, it depends on what you get in the Canvas Dropbox, right? So if you get something where the most common plagiarism I see is that the student clearly like copied and pasted an abstract from something and then didn't put it in quotes, so they forgot it was a quote, and then it ends up in the paper somehow. So I work a lot ahead of time now to get students thinking about how to mark sources so that they know when they could be accidentally plagiarizing. But if there's something kind of wholesale going on, like I have had a student copy and paste a whole website into their paper before. So I think definitely thinking about context matters, right? Because if we assume positive intent, for the most part, in my opinion and experience, plagiarism either happens because they didn't know how to cite sources, or to Justin's point earlier, sometimes it's some other crisis is happening in their life and they think, I better just turn something in and I'm just going to see what happens. So the other thing I do that really heads off plagiarism now is like halfway through the semester, I have a timed Canvas announcement that goes out that just says, hey, we have a lot of deadlines coming up. I just want you to know that I know that a lot of stuff happens in the middle of the semester. So if something is happening that's making it hard for you to complete your assignments, please email me and we can figure out a plan. And I think that that kind of empathy statement has helped a lot, where students now don't just avoid, and then send something in that's plagiarized, because they think, and it's true, that they can have a dialogue with me and we can figure out alternative dates for them to turn things in, and that I can help them connect to resources at the university level. So those two moves alone have headed off a lot of plagiarism that I used to deal with. But the other if you do get a plagiarized paper, I do think it's helpful to bring the student in if you have a course supervisor, don't have the conversation alone. And then the other thing that I wasn't prepared for, I guess, is that people really told me, when you have a plagiarism meeting, bring the student in and say, okay, here's this paper, here's the Turnitin score. What do you think is happening here? And the way people said that to me was like the student will then come clean, right? I have not found that to be the case. I have found that when you say, what is happening here? They're like, it's my paper, I wrote it. And you're like, okay, well, Turnitin says you didn't. And they're like, I wrote it. I have no idea why it would say that. So some students, when they're cornered, will double down instead of coming clean. And that makes the conversation even more stressful to me than just saying, okay, Turnitin says that this is plagiarized. And if they say it's not, just saying, I can see the websites that it's taken from. Benefit of the doubt, right? Perhaps you used these websites to gain some ideas and then accidentally things got put into the paper. So again, people's egos are on the line during difficult feedback conversations. And if you can kind of get them to get out of my identity is being threatened mode and into let's come up with a plan to fix this mode, the conversation will be more relaxed at that point. So I think that these are all great ideas that we're having in the chat too. Talk to mentors, that's a good one. I think that, definitely check with your department too about what their plagiarism policy is. If possible, I do like to say, I'm going to give you a 0 on this and you're welcome to redo it for half credit, something that kind of gives students a way to learn instead of just getting a 0 and being done with it. But there might be course policies in place that you have to follow. So just being aware and making sure you're on the same page as the rest of your department can be really helpful. Other ideas, game plans?
There's a comments in the chat. I know my department during my master's had a really clear process and expectations for how plagiarism cases should be handled. So I definitely think it's advantageous to talk with those mentors in the department, like Rebecca mentioned, undergrad coordinator or basic course director, to see if your department has those procedures in place.
Yeah, do we have like plagiarism hearings here? Because we did at Boulder, we had a student run kind of plagiarism court. So you had no choice. You had to send things through them. So just be aware. Okay, I'm going to throw you a curveball, and instead of putting it in the PowerPoint, I'm just going to read it to you. Next scenario, and write it in the chat. So we didn't talk about giving feedback to faculty, but let's say you're in a graduate class and it is full of readings that you think are not relevant, they're not up to date, the class is not going well, you're not learning what you would like to be learning. How would you address this? You look scared.
I just keep waiting.
I can go
There,
first and
Karen
say,
says salient, yes. Yeah, I put this in here because one of my friends who's in a graduate program, not here, said this to me about a month ago. Interesting. Okay, so maybe you could email the professor in a kind way and say, hey, this is interesting research. Maybe we could incorporate it. I think that's not a bad plan. So you're in a tough spot, right? If you haven't worked with the NCFDD, the National Center for Faculty Diversity and Development, their website is facultydiversity.org, and we have free membership using our UNLV emails, and they have really excellent webinars about unpacking the hidden scripts of academia and also being productive. So if you like energizing webinars, I recommend checking them out. They have really good units, and they also send out amazing emails every week that are always just way spooky in terms of how relevant they are. So the one they sent this week was called Pick Your Battles. And in this email, they were saying, there are a lot of injustices in academia. We know this to be true. And if you try to fight for every single one, you risk kind of like your own mental well-being at a certain point, right? And as a graduate student or an early career researcher, it's also difficult because you're in a precarious place of employment yourself. So this is not to say that fights are never worth having, but that it's worth weighing when it's worth having a battle and when it's not, and how that might change your relationship with the person you're considering that battle with. So I thought that was all very relevant because I do think that it's not uncommon, right? That in graduate school, you're excited, you're learning a lot of things, and some classes and topics are really going to be super exciting, and other classes and topics might feel like they're not serving you or they're not helping you develop in the ways that you're looking for. Okay, interesting. Yeah. So someone says, because their cohort functions as a team, which is lovely, navigating the class and after it's ending, discuss whether we'll have a member of the cohort with the highest rapport with the instructor, meet with the instructor and discuss it privately. So yeah, I think that the first thing to weigh is it worth having this conversation with this person, or am I just going to get through the class and move on? Is this person a committee member? Is this person someone I want to mentor me? Because then it might be worth engaging a little more. On the other hand, you don't want to damage the relationship. And you can think about, in communication studies, we talk about face threat. People have a way that they want to be seen. And if you do something that damages the way they want to be seen, that can be deeply hurtful to that person. So professors, because we're annoying this way and we, trained for too long and now we feel like we're experts in things, that can be part of our face. And if you come up to someone and say to them, you think you're an expert in this, but you should actually be doing it this way, right? That can be a very high face threatening message to deliver to someone. So just keeping that in mind, if you are going to approach someone to say, I know this is your area of expertise, but I would like you to do it differently, that can be a stressful conversation to have. So is it worth it? What kind of face damage could I be doing? But that's not to say you can't have the conversation. I think that this idea of like, hey, I found this new or interesting research. Is there a way we could incorporate that? That's not a bad way to approach it, right? Because it's like, I'm a student, I'm excited. Is there a way that we could, have a day where we all pick an article to discuss? Something like that can be useful. I will just say that two things that can make the face threat situation worse are jumping over the professor to someone above them, and them feeling like they didn't even know this was an issue, right? So sometimes like the nuclear option is like, we're all going to march into the department chair's office and demand change. And that might seem like an option. I wouldn't recommend it, basically, is what I'm telling you. I'm not saying this from autobiographical experience. And then the other thing that I think can be really challenging is like the hearsay thing. So just be aware that the dynamics of cohorts sometimes are such that you're talking to someone and they're like, that class sucked. And you're like, yeah, that class sucked. And then they go to the professor's office and they say, that class sucked and this person agrees with me. And they kind of drag you into it. And that can be even more of a sticky situation, right? To be like, me and 6 of my friends also agree. So I just think being careful about like speaking for yourself and not doing like a we're all ganging up on how much we hated this week of readings can help to diffuse the fraughtness of the feedback you're trying to give. And you as a grad student should also weigh that. If someone is like, hey, I think that this really happened to me in grad school. Someone was like, hey, I hate this class. And I was like, yeah, I'm having a hard time in that class too. And she was like, I'm going to the dean. I'm going to tell them that you also agree with me. And I was like, you absolutely are not doing that on my behalf, because this is not a battle that's worth fighting for me. It wasn't even in my department, right? So I was like, we all have to protect our peace about some things and decide what battles we're going to wage on the other hand. So I think that these are good things people are thinking through. And all just to say, I know that feedback can sometimes be needed for faculty, but I also know that it can be a precarious position to be in. So it's good to sort of have a plan, make your decisions about what you're willing to engage in and what maybe you need to just get through, which I know is not the most motivational speech I can be giving on this webinar. But other thoughts? All right, well then our last prompt, but if you have lingering thoughts, you can place them in the chat. is that you just swap papers with a fellow graduate student to give feedback before turning them in for grades. And you find that their paper is a bit of a mess, right? Like the sections are incomplete, lots of typos, many statements that need citations that don't have them. You think the argument has maybe been made in other papers. It's a week before the deadline. How would you approach giving this person feedback, and what kind of feedback would you give them?
I think it's a very difficult situation because the timeline is short and you're basically going to have to ask them to salvage the paper and do the best you can. So, I mean, I would almost feel like kind of thinking about what you said at the beginning, focus on what the few priorities were for this paper. Like maybe go to the rubric and see where where is the largest number of points going to come from and help them identify those areas to at least augment them as best you can in that last week rather than focusing on an overwhelming number of issues with the paper.
My cohort doesn't exchange papers. We have a member who wanted to go, and we advised her to go to the writing center. Okay, interesting. Yeah, so I think prioritizing is a good idea if you are swapping papers. I do ask people what level of feedback are you looking for? Because if people give you a paper the day before it's due, they're often looking for, I found this typo on page 2, otherwise great job, you're going to do great, because they're nervous, right? A week before, you have a little more time. So maybe picking like, what do I think would help this person to improve their grade the most would be a good strategy. I'm interested if, Catherine, not to put you on the spot, but if there's a reason your cohort isn't exchanging papers, if there's like a bit of a concern about that hurting people's feelings or wanting to keep it professional, which, sometimes, yeah, it does stress relationships a little to swap ideas with other people. So that is something you can weigh is, do this person and I have a relationship where we can swap papers and it will be okay? I have a friend from my master's who has read everything I've ever written, and I do the same for her. And I have a friend who just wants you to say, good job, I love it. So you learn that along the way. Yeah, so Elizabeth says I would give high-level feedback because a lot of detailed feedback can be overwhelming. Direct but friendly. Yeah, your section regarding this seems to need additional attention. I would recommend reviewing sources. Yeah, so I think it does really depend on the person and how well you know them, because direct feedback can be really helpful, but I try to be even goofier than that with my friends, right? I'll just try to be like, oh, I don't really get this. Can you explain it more? Or maybe you need this source. And that's just, I think we all do get a lot of very professional feedback. So it's nice to have a friendly voice in your paper. Yeah, be really clear on what type of feedback the other student was wanting. Did they want content review, citations? Interesting. Yeah, so I do think if you can set up some way to make sure it's fair, right? I did have a friend in grad school who I read everything she had ever written, and she never read anything I had written, because that was how the chips fell by the time she was done with her paper. So it is useful to think about, like, is this a fair relationship to be swapping with the other person? Or and you don't have to say like, no, I'm not going to swap papers with you because I don't think you'll be a good peer editor. You can just say like, oh, I'm still working on mine, I don't think I have time, right? So yeah, there are a bunch of different ways you can receive feedback. I also like Karen saying we talk about ideas instead of swapping papers. That is also really valuable. Like that's something you'll miss outside of grad school, is that when you have that audience of people who are all really in it with you, that really helps to develop ideas too. Great. So if you have any lingering thoughts in the chat, I would love to hear them. But just to wrap up, I think it's really great that you all are here and interested in mentoring and giving feedback. I didn't really think of myself as a mentor in graduate school, and certainly not in a formal sense, but not even in an informal sense. So you're ahead of the game on that. But the other thing I would just encourage you to keep in mind, if you're like, oh, I have to become the best mentor I can be, is that you're already a mentor to people and that you lead by example. When you teach, when you interact with bachelor students, they're inspired by you, right? You are ahead of them in what you're doing in your development as an academic. So you lead by example in a lot of ways too. So don't forget about that in terms of like, do I have to give people formal feedback all the time? Because just by being a great graduate student, you're already mentoring people. You're a mentor because you're working and developing ideas, and that's inspiring to people whether you know they're watching or not. You're a mentor in how you show them what it means to be an academic, in your attitude toward other people. Can you be kind and empathetic toward people you're giving feedback to? And you're a mentor just by being a professional contact in other people's lives. Are you responding to emails in a timely manner? Are you nice in those emails? Are you keeping up with the projects you're on? So even if you feel like, oh, I don't know where my job is as a formal mentor, you're an informal mentor in a lot of ways. So don't stress too hard, I guess, about how much feedback you're giving people, because you are a student first, and even by being a student and doing a great job at it, you are providing a model that other people are watching. So good job. Thanks so much for being here. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to take any in the chat, or if you want to email me, I put my email at the front of this PowerPoint, but I'll also just leave it here. But otherwise, I hope you all have a good day, and happy the semester is halfway over. Deep breaths, everyone.
I have a lingering question, Dr. Rice.
Yeah.
When you are giving feedback, how do you figure out if the feedback you're about to give is something that's essential for clarity or for making the argument versus something that is just a preference for you? Like how you would say something, for example.
Well, I think everything is a preference, so I think that is part of learning to trust yourself, right? That like if it's a thought you have, it's probably a thought some other readers are going to have. And you can say it in terms of like, I would do this way. This, you can say if the other way is totally fine, or if it is a little confusing. But people can take or leave your feedback either way, right? So you don't have to write it as if it's like the law. You can just say, my personal preference would be for this to be happening at this point in the paper. And that's also part of learning to take feedback for me, was understanding that the reader is right. Like if the reader wishes this sentence appeared 3 pages earlier, that is the way it should be. On the other hand, I had hilariously 2 professors in grad school at the same time, one of whom believed in a transition sentence at the end of every paragraph, and the other one who would be like, why are there so many transition sentences? Take them out. So I had to write completely differently in these 2 seminars at the same time. So yeah, it's a balance, and I think the more you read, the more you'll get a sense for, is this just my preference, or are a lot of other people doing it this way? And therefore, it's a pretty good rule of thumb.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
There are no more questions. Before we end today's session, we would like to thank Dr. Rebecca Rice again for sharing their time and expertise with us today, and to thank our participants for joining us today. Before y'all log off, please take a few minutes to fill out this workshop feedback survey that we dropped in the chat. I will drop it once again so that you can access it easily, and I hope all of you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.